Hello everyone and welcome back. Today I have for you 6 Let's Not Meet stories, and I am very excited for this video because I am hosting the very talented narrator. We shouldn't be here. As always, if you want to become a part of my Patreon family, the link is below, and also this drawing is available at my shop. So grab your flashlight and follow me into the darkness. The high school I attended was relatively small, maybe around 150 students back then. The dorm was even smaller, around 18 people, and it wasn't long before I found out that I would be rooming with Jacob for my first semester of 10th grade. Something we were both hoping for since the summer. Not long after arriving, we met the other new dorm students, and we were of course hazed by the old ones. During those first couple months, the new kids stuck together both in the dorm and at school. That is how I became friends with Harrison. Harrison was a big Chinese kid who was one grade below me in Jacob's class. He was one of the funniest people I had ever met, and he was just an all-around nice guy. We would hang out all the time during school hours, and I really felt like I got to know him as the weeks passed. Once I even went to his house, which was about 3 hours away from school, because I needed to catch the train from the particular town. Our friendship didn't last long, however, and it had nothing to do with him. I just made other friends I had more things in common with. I would occasionally say hi to Harrison if I passed him in school, but I never really talked to him in the dorm anymore. My 10th grade year passed, and Jacob and I became even closer friends, and in 11th grade, Mason joined our friend group. Although none of us talked to Harrison, we started to notice that he had become a lot more depressed. Harrison's roommate would tell us about how he would never clean up after himself. Harrison would sleep on top of his dirty laundry and would not flush the bathroom, something that caused a lot of problems with his other 3 bathroom buddies. Our dorm parents started having problems with Harrison. He wouldn't show up for dinner. He'd often be late to school and would never listen to authority. At one point, Harrison left the dorm for a while just to be with his family. Senior year and everything was much of the same. Only one specific night that got everyone in school talking. Jacob, Mason, and I were hanging out with our dorm mom when our dorm dad came into the room, a worried look on his face. "Where's Harrison?" he asked quietly but clearly worried. We told him we didn't know, and he stared at the ground for a moment. "Stay with my wife." About 20 minutes passed before he came back to the dorm. He looked serious, which was unusual for him. After thinking for a second, he sat the 3 of us down and explained a little bit of the situation. Harrison was dangerous, and he needed to be found. He told us to stay with his wife, who was pregnant at the time, and to tackle Harrison if we saw him enter the kitchen. Up until that point, we didn't know what was going on, but we knew enough to stay up with our dorm mom. It must have been 11 p.m. when we saw Harrison enter the dorm. We eyed him as he went into his room and then out again. Our dorm mom was calling her husband quietly as we observed. About 5 minutes later, our dorm dad, the girls' dorm dad, the dorm administrator, all rushed into Harrison's room. I stayed sitting next to a dorm mom, holding her hand as she quietly told us to not tell anyone at school. Jacob, Mason, and I started talking among ourselves. We had no idea why this was happening. All we knew was that Harrison was a dangerous guy. We eventually went to bed after my dorm mom had calmed down. The following night, our dorm dad held a meeting. He didn't really tell us anything, but he did tell us that Harrison was not coming back to the dorm. He also told us not to tell people at school. Everyone in high school was talking about it by the next week. Harrison eventually returned to school a month after the incident, but because he wasn't allowed in our dorm, his parents rented an apartment near school. I didn't see much of him after that, and I eventually graduated. I moved to the city where Jacob's family lived, so I kept in touch with him all the time. I wish the story ended there, but unfortunately took an even more sinister turn. One morning, I get a call from Jacob's dad. He wanted to talk about something with me, something that had happened to Jacob. He told me that ever since the incident, the school administration had taken a closer look at Harrison's situation, eventually deciding to search his phone and his laptop. They found over 200 pictures of Jacob on his phone, along with some other disturbing images. Plus, they weren't pictures he had taken off Jacob's Facebook or anything. These were pictures Harrison had secretly taken. The weird thing was that Harrison never seemed to stalk Jacob, as Jacob himself related to me afterward. Jacob, Mason and I never suspected anything. Jacob's dad also told me that once they found the pictures, they took Harrison in for questioning. Harrison confessed that he constantly fantasized about murdering Jacob, but it wasn't just murder. He thought about slowly torturing Jacob. He described the torture in graphic details. Harrison had written about it 100 times in his notebook. Taking pictures of Jacob was apparently the way it fueled his imagination. I believe the night the three of us stayed by our dorm mom was the night he was going to carry out the murder. The exact details of why they let him back in school after that are not clear to me, but he was immediately expelled when they found out about the murder plot from his own mouth. Harrison had gone mad, and he hadn't even noticed, or at least, we hadn't made the connection. Jacob was in shock. He told me that Harrison planned to murder him because he felt like he, Jacob, was the dorm's dad favorite. Harrison had such a messed up mind that he thought he would become the favorite if he killed Jacob. I understand that Harrison's parents might not have been the best parents in the world, but that in no way justifies how deranged his motive was. Jacob, Mason and I were all very close to our dorm mom and dad. What if he had seen the three of us as potential targets? I was relieved he had been expelled and that nothing awful had happened while Mason and I were still at school. Jacob is all right now. It's been a while since Harrison was expelled. For a time, his parents were worried because Harrison still lived in the same city. But I think those fears have died down since nobody had heard much of him. So Harrison, I hope you get the help you need, but you were still planning to murder my friend, and for that, let's never meet again.
This happened several years ago, during my second year of university. I lived in a private, student-rented house with 2 other students for my course. This happened during the weekend, when my 2 housemates were away visiting family and friends. I stayed at the house due to upcoming exams and lots of revision to be had. I am a female and was at the time in my early 20s. To note, although I'm not entirely sure it's related, 2 weeks prior on the way home from my part-time job around 10:30 p.m., I was followed by 2 men around mid-20s, both in dark clothing, hoodies, jogging bottoms, and more. They kept shouting things to get my attention, like, "Hey!" And I'd pretty much sprinted home once I'd realized they were trying to alert me. They never got close enough for me to see their face or identity, and I never looked back to see if they were still behind me and saw where I lived. It was around 1 a.m. on Sunday morning, and I was revising in my room, which was on the ground floor at the back of the house through the kitchen. I was sure I had locked all of the doors, but the student houses were horrible and had even worse security measures. There had also been rumors of a few break-ins in that area for high-value items like computers and laptops. But as usual, I figured it won't happen to me. Shortly after 1:15 a.m., I hear some muffled, deep voices that sounds like they're coming from next door. I listen intently. I realize the voices sound much closer and in fact could be at the front of our house. I listen for a few minutes trying to gauge exactly where the voices are. Suddenly the voices stop, and I hear my front door rattling, like someone is trying the door handle and inadvertently rattling the whole crappy door. Panic sets in and my blood runs cold as I realize someone is trying to enter the house. I also know that my two roommates aren't due home until late Sunday evening. Student houses have individual door locks on all bedroom doors, so I slowly slide across my desk and wince as I carefully turn the lock on my door. I slowly turn off my small desk lamp, and I crawl underneath my desk, gripping my mobile phone in my now very sweaty hot hands, and I close my eyes. I hear the front door open, and heavy footsteps flood the hallway just on the other side of the front door. At this point, I'm silently crying and trying to process the million-and-one thoughts flying through my head. I had sliding patio doors in my room that led out into our back garden, but the garden just led onto someone else's garden, and we had a large fence all around that I would not have been able to climb over inconspicuously. I decided I wasn't prepared to try and escape through fear of drawing attention to myself. Instead, I stayed underneath the desk, paralyzed with fear. I heard the footsteps go directly upstairs. They are almost running around the second floor of the house. I hear banging and rummaging and sometimes the deep voices again. I am still at this point sitting, trembling underneath my desk, expecting my door handle to be rattled at any second. About 5 or so minutes pass, though this felt like an eternity, and I hear them running downstairs and presumably out of the way they came in. I remain where I am for another 15 minutes or so and eventually dial 911 and briefly whisper what has happened, though I am pretty hysterical at this point, and I'm unable to confirm to the call handler whether the intruders are still inside. 5 or 6 minutes later, the police arrive and confirm the door was tampered with and forced open. My two roommates' laptops had been taken. They suggested that as my room was downstairs, and through the kitchen they must have presumed it was not a bedroom, and likely headed straight upstairs to where they thought these items would be. The police also suggested they may have believed nobody was home, hence their brazen entry to the property. Although I escaped this unharmed, it still haunts me to this day to think what could have happened if they noticed that I was home, or if they had their way into my bedroom. Although I can't know for sure that they would have just ran off once realizing I was there, I often imagine the worst and pray that I never meet the men that broke into my house.
This takes place in October 1977, when my mom was 16. She ran away from her abusive home along with her friend Lisa. They hitchhiked from us all the way to California. Obviously, this wasn't the brightest of plans, but given my mom's home life and past experiences, she didn't see how it could be much more dangerous than anything she'd already experienced. They had a pretty safe and uneventful trip across the country, finding friends and many truck drivers and other travelers. It wasn't until they reached California when this encounter happens. The hillside strangler ended up being 2 men who were caught and brought to justice for 10 murders. So my mom and Lisa end up meeting these 2 guys who were super nice to them. They crashed at their place for a few days, partying, but nothing bad had come off at this point. These guys tell the girls that they are going to take them to the Hollywood Hills. Not being from the area, my mom had no idea that these areas were more crime-ridden that time, especially considering they were supposed to be sightseeing. My mom really wanted to see where all the movie stars lived. These guys take my mom and her friend to some dive restaurant bar and get them super drunk. It's also the first time my mom is introduced to and tries cocaine. After these underage girls are now completely high and drunk, they split off into pairs and my mom's friend disappears with one of these guys. My mom is now hanging out with just one of her new guy friends. He then suggests that they stand on the sidewalk and if a car pulls up, she should get in and direct the driver to drive across the street to this dark parking lot. It isn't really until the first and only car pulls up and she gets in and that she has realized this guy is prostituting her out. Keep in mind, these guys had been nothing but kind and respectful to my young mom and friend for the past few days. Also, and very sadly, this type of abuse is not a new concept for her either. She gets into this car and instead of pulling into the parking lot, he keeps driving straight. My mom explains that he's going the wrong way, so he starts driving faster. My mom moves towards the door, but he locks it, hits her and attempts to hold her down at the same time. He tells her she isn't going to go anywhere. My mom knew in her head she needed to get the fuck out of the car or she would be dead. So in one swift move, she unlocks the door, tucks and rolls out of the car. His car comes screeching to a halt. She sees some bushes in front of a house, so she runs to and hides behind them. He's turned around, looking for her, creeping along. His passenger side was facing where she was hiding, and she was peeking through the bushes. She saw he had a gun. As soon as his car crept by, she ran to the backyard. It was all fenced in. There was no other way out, so she had to go back the way she came. By the time she crawled back into the bushes to see if he was still around, she saw his car had gone to the end of the road and turned back around. So he passes again, and when she thought he was far enough away, she crawled out of the bushes to run. But then she sees his brake lights. Confident that he's now seen her, she runs as fast as possible around a corner. But she could hear his car, so she had to duck and hide behind parked cars on the road. As soon as he passes again, she looked it across the street, which took her through the parking lot she was originally supposed to park in, and back to her friend. The creep did circle back again, but by then she was with her friend and they were leaving the area. My mom and her friend quickly ditched these two assholes and did find a safer place to stay. But only a short time later did my mom call home and eventually made it home safely. It wasn't until a long time later that she saw on the news a story about two women being murdered and recognized the murderer, dubbed the hillside strangler as the man who had picked her up that night.
This incident that I'm about to speak of occurred when I was 15 years old, 11 years ago. I lived on a road that was perpendicular to a very busy main road in my town. Not Boston busy, mind you, but busy by our standards. On the other side of the road was an elderly folks' home that had a nice outdoors area with a swing set, an outdoor checkers table, and some picnic tables. I liked to go out late at night, and I thought that I was invincible at that age. I do not think that anymore. So on this night, it was around midnight. My mom wasn't home. I forgot where she was. I think she was working. So I decided to walk across the street to the swing set and swing on the swings. There was a street light where the swings were, and it was so close to my house that I felt safe. There's almost no one out in my town at that time of night, and I would see cop cars driving down the road occasionally, which gave me the illusion of safety. I had my earbuds in my ears, blasting my favorite music with the volume all the way up. I was happily swinging there for a while, for maybe 20 minutes. In between songs, there was a few seconds of silence. And that's when I heard it, a sound of some sort. Puzzled, but not alarmed. I paused my music, but didn't take out my earbuds completely, and I kept swinging. This time I heard it distinctly. It was someone whistling. I stopped swinging and took out my earbuds. I looked around. I could vaguely see a man's silhouette, about half a football field's length away from me, leaning under a streetlight. Then he whistled again, the kind of utility whistling some people can do with 2 fingers. It seemed very loud for how far away he was. My first thought was that he was hailing a cab. I quickly realized that couldn't be possible. I lived in a town. We didn't even have cabs. And it was midnight, and even if he called for a cab, you don't whistle them down. Again, that's just not something that happens here. It was just my brain trying to make sense of the situation. So why was he whistling? Whose attention was he trying to get? There was no one out here. That's when a shiver went down my spine. Was he whistling at me? Was he trying to get my attention? I was snapped to attention when the man suddenly shouted, "Hey!" He shouted it aggressively, like he just watched someone steal from him. Then the silhouette left from under the streetlight, walking in my general direction. As soon as he was out from under the streetlight, I lost him in the inky blackness. I started to sweat. My eyes darted through the darkness, frantically looking for him, but I saw nothing, not even movement. Then from the darkness he started whistling again, but this time it wasn't a basic whistle. He was whistling what sounded like a warped sing-song whistle, the kind where those ballerinas that have little sing-song chimes. It was like if one of those had somehow gotten screwed up, and it was playing this weird, dissonant melody, like a music box from a horror movie. My heart leapt into my throat. My eyes kept searching for him, but found nothing. The sing-song whistle got louder. I could tell he was advancing on me. But where was he? He got closer and closer, and I honestly wanted to cry. I was so scared. I kept telling myself, run, just run. The longer you sit here, the closer he gets. For the love of God, just run. But I couldn't. I couldn't will my limbs to move. I was paralyzed with fear. The sing-song got closer and closer, until it felt like he couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. I could hear his heavy breathing now, and I still couldn't see him. I wanted to scream at him. What did this guy want? I summoned all my courage, but only managed to squeak out a meek, "Hello?" It was then that he started laughing. This laugh, I can't even describe it. It just sounded so sinister. I felt like I could almost hear how badly this man wanted to hurt me. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I've never heard a laugh like that before. And I watch a lot of horror. It sounded psychotically crazy, like the laughter of a deranged lunatic about to descend on his helpless prey. I truly believed I was going to die. Every cell of my body was screaming at me to run, but I felt like I couldn't move. Finally, all at once, I leapt out of the swing with as much force as I could muster, and took off running. And he kept on laughing. I ran all the way to my house, slammed the front door shut, and I locked it. It occurred to me that it was so close by, it's possible that he saw where I ran to. But I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. I needed to get somewhere safe immediately. I quickly locked all the doors and the windows and triple-checked them. Then I walked into the kitchen, sank to my knees, and started crying. I had never been so scared in all my life. I felt like a gazelle that narrowly escaped a cheetah. I feel like he was close enough to catch me running, but he just didn't go after me. Maybe it caught him off guard. Maybe he was just someone trying to scare me. I don't know. But his laugh makes me believe otherwise. His laugh didn't sound like a dumb frat boy playing a prank on a young girl. There was seriously something wrong with it. I cried on the kitchen floor and was so tired that I fell asleep on the tiles. I know this goes without saying, but I hope I never see that deranged whistle man again.
A few years ago, I was in the process of getting a divorce. My wife had left me for another guy, and I was at a pretty low point. My closest friends were her brothers-in-law, and while they stuck by me, it felt weird to me at the same time to be hanging out with my soon-to-be ex's family. So I was spending a lot of time alone. I could not handle standing at the house all the time by myself, and pretty much any excuse to get out was something I jumped on. Which is how I ended up at a concert at a local bar alone, and where this story really begins. I was actually pretty excited to see this band. They were from our area, but have managed to become pretty big nationally, and they're very popular around here. I showed up early so I could get a seat at the bar and chill, rather than have to stand in front of the stage and not have room to move. I ended up waiting for the doors to open with a relatively small group of people, maybe 15 or 20 of us. One of the others waiting at the door was her. She had the look of someone who'd been on some very heavy drugs for years. I could tell she was probably around my age, but she looked at least 20 years older than she actually was. I could also tell she was currently on something, and had also been drinking pretty heavily before coming to the bar. She was staggering and slurring her words, but just managed to keep it together enough that they didn't kick her out. She was wearing what I assume she thought was concert attire, but she honestly looked like a prostitute, a tube top with a way too small jacket over it and an extremely short skirt. This was in February, and it was snowing and about 20 degrees. I am assuming she thought she was hot. She was disgusting. She was standing with a group of 4 or 5 people, but kept looking my direction and making me feel very uncomfortable when I caught her looking at me. Anyway, they finally let us in, and I found a spot at the bar where I thought I'd be able to see the stage pretty well. Settled in and ordered a beer. This woman and her group wandered around for a bit until it started getting crowded, and then ended up standing very near to me. She was close enough for me to smell her. Awesome. Once the warm-up band started playing, I managed to enjoy myself. A couple at the bar next to me ended up being pretty cool, and I spent some time talking to them between bands. I had planned on only having a couple of beers since I was alone and I had to drive home in the snow. But the guy ended up buying a bucket of beers without asking me and wanted to split in. He's been cool, so I was like, what the hell, I call a cab if I have to. By the time the main band started, I was on my 6th and feeling pretty good. It was at this point that the crack whore started hitting on me. I told her I wasn't interested, and she moved back to her group for a couple of songs. It wasn't long before she was back though. This time, she started grinding all over me and ended up falling into my lap. I tried to help her get off me as politely as I could, while hiding my disgust. I am pretty laid back and don't like to be rude to people, so I was still trying to be nice at this point. Unfortunately, instead of taking the hint, she turned and wrapped her arms around my neck, and I was forced to stand up and practically dumped her off me. If she hadn't had a grip on me, I have no doubt she'd been on the floor. I forcibly peeled her off me and once again told her I wasn't interested, and she sulked back to her friends. The next person who came over was one of the girl's male friends. "What's wrong with you, man? She really likes you. You gay or something?" Again, try to be as polite as possible, I replied. "No, I am not gay. I'm just not interested. Sorry." The two I'd befriended luckily had my back and told the dude to fuck off. The girl even told him I was out of that crack whore league, which definitely made me feel pretty good about myself. He went back to their group and they moved away, and I went back to enjoying the concert and had a great time. After the show, the couple told me they actually knew the band and asked if I wanted to meet them. Of course I did. Plus, I needed some time to sober up before going home anyway, so they led me out back where the band's tour buses were. I say tour buses, but they were mostly old RVs. Anyway, go to meet the bands and hang out with them for a bit, which was awesome. I was offered more beer and other things of the greener variety, which I declined, knowing I needed to go home at this point. It was then that I noticed Crack Whore and her group were still around, and they were all staring daggers at me. 3 girls and 2 guys. Once I saw this, I sobered up even faster and finally decided it was probably time to leave, since the crowd was getting pretty thin and I definitely didn't want to be there anymore. I walked pretty quickly to my car, which was in a fairly empty area of the parking lot, and I could hear the group behind me. I jumped in and headed out. Unfortunately, they followed. I could see them get in another car and pull out behind me. It's still snowing, and I know I probably still shouldn't be driving, even on clear roads, so I'm trying to stay calm and not to do anything to get pulled over. When I hit the highway and they were still right on my butt, I decided, screw it. So I started trying to lose them. The roads were slick, but I was in an SUV and they were in an old beater with presumably crappy tires. In the first sharp turn, I look. I skidded a little on the snow, but held it on the road. They were not so lucky. I watched them slide off the side of the road and into the ditch and chuckled to myself victoriously. I am not heartless though. Even when somebody deserves it, I wasn't going to leave 5 people possibly injured in a ditch to freeze to death. Plus, I was pretty sure they were gonna go to jail, so I called 911 and told them about the accident. I didn't stop or mention that they were chasing me though. I did not want to talk to the cops or to go back and have to see them again. And I was also pretty sure that while I felt completely sober at this point, I probably still wouldn't pass a breathalyzer myself. So I just made the call and went home. Not sure what ended up happening with them, but I never saw them again, despite going to plenty of concerts in the same area since.
When I was around 6, I'm 23 now. Just before starting school, I had to stay at my grandparents' place for around 6 months due to my parents constantly traveling for work. It happened in Europe, a little country called Lithuania, which is a really cool and modern country with a fast internet. And living in blocks of flats by the year 2000 was pretty much normal. My grandma lived in a block of flats, 5-story building in a peaceful community neighborhood. My grandmother was working as a nanny at the time, and she had one more girl, which was from Washington, staying with us. Me and the girl were playing outside, and we noticed a man in a brown leather jacket and brown pants lingering around block and the entrance of out blocks of flats. Being kids, we didn't pay much attention to him, or even found his behavior suspicious. I remember passing him by the time we had to go home, and him holding the door for us. He had dark hair, and these almost neon blue eyes. My grandmother's flat was on the last, 5th floor. 3 of us are having dinner, when my grandfather, who at the time was working night shifts at the local billiard club, was leaving for work. We have dinner, say bye to Grandpa, and were off to bed. Mind you, back then nobody locked the front door of the apartment or house, because everybody knew their neighbors and trusted them in the time of need. My grandmother is telling a bedtime story, and it's already dark outside, late August, when we hear 3 muffled sounds, as if it's furniture falling. My grandmother rushes to lock the door for some reason. She tells us probably somebody's redecorating and moving their furniture, and we fall asleep. Fast forward to the next morning. My grandfather is coming back from work. It's around 6 a.m. He finds the front door open of the apartment that belonged to a family living on the 3rd floor. He walks in and finds a dead grandmother and a boy, which was around 5 years old, and also our friend, dead, with shot wounds. Me and the girl are immediately woken up. There's police everywhere. We were asked if we saw anything suspicious or people not from our neighborhood. Of course, we remembered the man. Later on, he was found guilty of that particular murder, and it was all over local newspapers. Since then, everybody I know, including myself, locks the doors.
Hey there, and thank you so much for listening. If you like this video, please leave a thumbs up. And if you like my videos and want to see more, subscribe to my channel. And I will see you all in my next video.